I have been honored to work with Hiroshi for many years. I'm honored to be part of a field in which he is a leader, and I'm honored to call him my friend and musical collaborator. That's another story. Tonight, Professor Motomura will discuss his most recent book, which is provocatively titled Immigration Outside the Law. It's a timely and I think aptly titled book that deals thoughtfully with some of the deepest dilemmas of both immigration policy and the meaning of law itself, which I think we'll get to in discussion, which he's going to speak for about 30 minutes or so, 30, 40 minutes, and then take some questions, and hopefully we can have a conversation about all those things. I always learn a great deal from him, and I'm sure that tonight will be no exception, so please join me in welcoming Hiroshi Motomura.
Thank you so much, and thanks for being here tonight, braving the weather, although I guess you've had a lot of weather for the last 6 months. So, yeah, it's a real pleasure and honor to be here to share some thoughts with you based on the book that I wrote, Immigration Outside the Law, and it's a book that I worked on for some 7 or 8 years. And I think that one of the things I realized is I was a year away from finishing this book for about 5 years. It's sort of the way these things go, and I think a lot of it is because of the complexity of the subject. As Dan said, this is a very contentious field. One of the things that I try to bring to it as an academic is that I have some pretty strong views on some bottom line issues with regard to immigration policy. But I also lament the polarization, the political polarization that's happened on this issue over the last, you name it, 2 years, 5 years, maybe the last generation. Not that it's ever been a site of universal consensus, but part of the reason I wrote this book was not only to explain the way I think about these issues and to suggest some ways to think about it, but also to try to get a conversation going so that at least people who disagree with each other have some sense of why they disagree with each other. So the book at a larger level has 2 purposes. One is to create a framework for understanding why people might disagree with each other. And the other purpose of it is actually to suggest some things. So there's a lot going on in the book. So maybe what I should do is, so that we have, I want to provoke you to ask some questions, and I'm really very interested in what you push back against, what you'd like to hear more about. So what I'm going to do is just to keep this first part of this as succinct as possible, and to tell you a little bit about where the book is coming from the sense of, what exactly prompted me to write it and what it's about. And then I'd like to give you a sense of what the structure of the book is. In other words, how I go about trying to help explain why people disagree so much about what the book calls immigration outside the law. The very title, Immigration Outside the Law, is an attempt to start from a more neutral place than illegal aliens or undocumented immigrants. The term I use in the book is unauthorized migrants, which is kind of a social science term, and it may seem like odd English to talk about unauthorized migrants. It's often that you talk about the undocumented or people here illegally, but I'm really starting in this more neutral place. And I'm trying to really unpack the debates. So here's what I should explain about the book. Dan generously mentioned an earlier book I wrote called Americans in Waiting. And I want to tell you a little bit about that because these 2 books are in many ways companion books to each other. And I guess when you look at it that way, it took me 16 years to write these 2 books. But Americans in Waiting is really about the relationship that this country's had between how we treat immigrants and how we treat citizens. And we think of ourselves as a nation of immigrants, but what does that really mean? And in particular, let me just show you, this is the cover of the book. And so it says this family in Chinatown, 1920s, waiting to cross the street. So that's really thinking about, are immigrants Americans in waiting? Do we treat them as future Americans, or we treat them presumptively as outsiders, or are they presumptively insiders? And so the dilemma that this book tries to confront is this, that we think of ourselves as a country dedicated or built on some notion of equality, or aspiring to equality, and at the same time, we seem to take it for granted that we have a national border. something about having a national border that immediately creates inequality. People are on the outside, people are on the inside. That seems like a regime that has inequality built into it, and yet we think of ourselves as a country that takes equality seriously. And so this is a very fundamental dilemma, and that's, in many respects, the subject matter for Americans in Waiting, and in particular the question of how do you deal with equality, how do non-citizens fit into that if you create non-citizens through citizenship laws. And in particular, I'm trying to figure out how this equality dilemma matches up with the idea we have immigrants, we have citizens. And my solution to this, which just giving the very short version because the long version is usually the book, is that there are ways that we can be faithful to equality if we give people access to equality, if we allow immigrants the chance to become citizens. They don't have to be equal to start with, but we have to give them access to equality. And some of the access to equality, many of the arguments for access to equality are grounded in various notions that I think, if I name them, are going to be very familiar to you from just reading the newspaper or just having conversations with people. And that is sometimes we think of the way we treat immigrants, our sense of fairness, the way we treat immigrants is to protect expectations. People come here, maybe you think that they promise not to go on welfare, or they promise not to commit crimes, or something like that. It's that kind of language. So one of the things I developed in this book is the idea of immigration as a contract. That's something you often hear, but you notice that sometimes when we talk about immigrants and we say, well, someone who's in the country illegally, they've built a life here, they've contributed, they have a stake here. Now one could argue that they've broken the immigration contract by breaking the law, or by being here in violation of law. But then there's a counter-argument, which is that might be true, but we might say that we want to offer them legal status because they've earned it in some sense, and that they've become part of the society, and that's really what this book talks about as immigration as an affiliation. And then the third idea that the book explores is that it was particularly in the 1800s, a time when I think this country treated immigrants much more with the expectation that they would become U.S. citizens. We allowed people before they became citizens to vote. We allowed them to homestead, and they could do this. They could vote and they could homestead. Pretty much from their arrival in this country, and that's no longer true. So this was the idea that we're going to presume that immigrants are citizens. We're going to presume that Americans in waiting. This book is really about that phenomenon, but it develops a vocabulary for thinking about what justice is in the immigration context. How can we reconcile equality with the very fact of borders? And one of the ways is to develop a vocabulary, not just a word vocabulary, but a conceptual framework for understanding that immigrants have certain kinds of claims, and these are the types of things they have. And if we respect those claims, then maybe we can be a nation devoted both to equality and to the idea that at least that the borders serve some kind of function. The difficulty with this, by the way, and I'll come back to this, so this is going to be a footnote in this part of my explaining this two-book project, is that the idea of intending citizenship, the idea that you could come to this country and be presumptively American, that was tied to the idea of intending citizenship. In other words, that you could declare your intent to become a citizen, and then you'd be treated in this way. This is what this book tries to recover. This is why the subtitle is The Lost Story of Immigration and Citizenship. The catch, and it's a big catch, is that citizenship access was racially restricted until 1952. So this was the way European immigrants were treated. But to be slightly cynical about it, as immigration became much more open in the 20th century, and the discriminatory rules were gradually dismantled by the mid part of the 20th century, as immigration became more open, it became less valuable to become an immigrant. It became less of a presumptive, you're going to be an American. So that's what this book is about. But I say this because this kind of way of thinking about it is really what propelled me to this next project that I'm sharing with you tonight. Because Americans in Waiting is not a book that addresses undocumented, unauthorized, or illegal immigration. It doesn't really talk about the 11 million people country without lawful status. And that was one of the criticisms I got about this book, is where are the 11 million people? And of course the answer is, I have to write another book about that, which took another 8 years. And that's what this book is about. This is about immigration outside the law. I don't need to restart my computer. We don't want to restart the computer.
It says those updates are
No, it's that's right. Well, I'm not going to restart the computer now. Okay, I know that's fine. I got 15 minutes then. Okay, but here's the structure of the book. There's a Supreme Court case called Plyler versus Doe. Some of you may have heard of it. It was decided by the U.S. Supreme Court in 1982. In 1982, the Supreme Court of the United States, in a narrow 5-4 decision, held that the state of Texas could not bar kids from going to public school, K through 12 public schools. The state of Texas could not bar them on account of their immigration status. Or more specifically, it could not bar them because they were in the country illegally. And this is a bedrock decision of American law in the sense that one can think of it as potentially precarious decision in the sense that, I think it was a very narrow 5-4 decision. It was a decision that one could say, well, if it rose today, there might be some doubt as to how the case would come out of the Supreme Court. But the reason I start with the decision is because it's an interesting window into the way this country thinks about immigration. When Justice Brennan wrote for the majority, that Texas could not keep kids out of K through 12 public schools just because they were in the country illegally, he had to do 3 things, I think. There are 3 issues that he had to confront, and on these 3 issues, the dissent, the 4 justices for the dissent, had to come up with a very different formulation and had to take a very different approach. So I'm really using, the book starts with Plyler, and it starts with Plyler as a lens for thinking about debates, because Justice Brennan had to do 3 things. And one of the things, well, I'm going to go into in a second as to what he actually did, but one of the things I want to suggest is that in saying that, tying 2 books together, one of the things that happens in that decision, and in my book actually, there's a bottom line here, is are unauthorized migrants Americans in waiting? The answer I give in this book is yes. In other words, the project of the first book extends to thinking about people here without lawful status. But I need to explain why I think that to be true, and that journey starts with Plyler. Plyler, in Plyler, Justice Brennan really had to do 3 things. Just to review a simple diagram, which actually appears in the introduction of the book. The first thing Justice Plyler had to say, and he does say this, is that people are in the country illegally, but that doesn't mean they're going to be deported. It doesn't mean they're going to be deported, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they were simple lawbreakers. There's a sense in that opinion that we have a labor policy, a de facto labor policy that says that tolerates people being here, and we've relied on unauthorized labor for generations. So that complicates this question of what it means to be in the country. So one of the things he ends up doing is really coming down on this question of are people here undocumented or are they illegal? So Justice Brennan, that's one thing that Justice Brennan does. The other thing Justice Brennan does, he says that the state of Texas has no business, no legitimate business, deciding who's going to be in this country or not. So the second thing he has to do is to take a very narrow view of what it is that states and local cities do. And the third thing he has to decide, and he says this, is he says, these kids are going to be in this country. And it's a national tragedy if we allow a group of people to grow up in this country without an education, without a public education. And this is the part of the decision where Justice Brennan quotes Brown versus Board of Education and says, education is the key, the essential element in citizenship. So he has to do this in order to reach his decision. Could have gone the other way. The dissenters say, people are in the country illegally, that really should be the only way. The dissent also says, the state and local role is really legitimately includes making decisions about access to public benefits, including to public education. And the dissent really is unwilling to think of these kids as having a legitimate place in American society. So what this book tries to do is, these are actually the first 3 chapters. The first chapter is trying to confront the various views of what it means to be in the country without lawful status. The second chapter chronicles the historical role of states and localities. And the third chapter confronts the question of why we have borders and how, in my view, that unauthorized migrants have claims to be treated as Americans away. And I want to say a little bit more about the engine that drives this, which I think is really number one, undocumented or illegal. I want to say a little bit more about that. But I think before I do that, let me go on and talk about the structure of the book and how I sort of unpacking this. And I hope that as I go through this, you see that, you know, a lot of times you hear debates about immigration policy, and one side says, well, you know, people in the country unlawfully, that's just not that big a deal. It's like, you know, driving 60 miles an hour and 55 mile an hour speed limit. But other people are saying, essentially, what part of illegal don't you understand, right? So it's that captures that debate in chapter 1. State of Arizona has taken a lot of measures to try, and actually Georgia and Alabama and several other states have taken measures to enforce immigration law. That's, you know, that was true when Texas tried to do it in the 1970s and early 1980s. Same thing today. And when you talk about, some people think of people who are undocumented here, and the conversation is really, well, they're just part of us. And other people really reject that notion. And so these 3 themes in Plyler end up being the lens through I think it's possible to kind of understand why people disagree with each other. So let me just say a little bit more about the structure of the book, go back to a little bit more to what it says in chapter number 1, and then see what questions you have about this. And I could give you, like, you know, a summary of every chapter, but that would be here longer than you probably want to be. So one of the controversies that's come up recently, as I mentioned, is the state of Arizona and other states have been trying to enforce immigration law. So why do people disagree with me about that? Okay, well, that's chapter 4 about enforcement. I think it's really hard to decide what Arizona's role should be in enforcing immigration law. It's hard to decide what Arizona's role should be unless you have some view of what it means to be in the country unlawfully. If you believe that being in the country unlawfully is a very serious offense, and it's very clear what that offense is, then I think it stands to reason that you would want more people deputized to apprehend, detain, and deport people. Because, after all, they're part of illegal non-jurisdiction. If, however, you think that you prefer the word undocumented and think of people as the unlawful presence is not a serious violation, then I think that you're going to be very reluctant to empower every cop on the beat to make decisions about who should be deported. But, so that's chapter 4. And chapter 5 recognizes that the state and local role is not just to enforce. The state and local role is also to be the place where immigrants, regardless of their lawful or unlawful status, become integrated into communities. And so, chapter 5 is about building communities. And those states that decided not to enforce, which is what I talk about in chapter 4, those states that have decided not to enforce, but rather to give in-state tuition to undocumented students, or give driver's licenses, for example, or decided to recognize labor rights, for example, that's where communities are built. That vision of the state and local role only follows if you these states, and I do think this is true in these states, that the legislators that have decided to have in-state tuition, for example, for undocumented students, that there is a recognition that those students are Americans. So this is an attempt to show that the state and local role really has two aspects, and they connect the three original Plyler themes in a certain way. And the last, almost the last part of this structure, before I go back and say more about chapter 1, is legalization of the rule of law. There's a lot of debate today about whether people who are in the country unlawfully should be given legal status. There's a lot of debate about it's called legalization, or sometimes the word amnesty is thrown around, although that's become kind of a word that people try to avoid these days. And the real question is, what explains why people disagree on giving people lawful status? And a lot of it is because those who really are for legalization start out with a certain vision of what it means to be in the country unlawfully, and then combine it with the fact that these undocumented migrants are Americans in waiting, and then it stands to reason that not only should they be legalized, be given legal status, but it also stands to reason that doing so is consistent with the rule of law, in spite of their unlawful status, because it recognizes through law their place in American society. So this is another way of understanding why people disagree about, I think, 4, 5, and 6. 4 is about why people disagree about Arizona. 5 is about why people disagree about driver's licenses and ID cards and in-state tuition for the undocumented or unauthorized. And 6 is an attempt to sort of bring together chapters 1 and 3 to figure out what it is that people disagree about when they talk about legalization. And by legalization, I mean giving green cards eventually and a path to citizenship to people who are in the country unlawfully, but it's also about things like the DREAM Act, which would grant lawful status to people who are in the country who were brought here as children. And then chapter 7, chapter 7, let's go through this real quick. Chapter 7 goes a little further and says, where are the answers to be found? And this is the chapter when it deals with the role that temporary workers might play in dealing with unauthorized migration. It deals with the role that international economic development can play. And it also deals with the role that educational policy in this country could play in making sure that immigrants who come in don't displace and disadvantage people who are really in the most precarious position economically and socially inside the United States who are already here. So that's really the basic structure. So I have to say that a lot of the book doesn't lend itself into sort of like, well, here's like the 25-word argument, because much of the book, I have to say, is an attempt to take about 40 different subjects and show how they all relate to each other. So this book talks about the DREAM Act, it talks about temporary workers, it talks about Arizona, it talks about birthright citizenship and the idea that people born in this country are citizens, it talks about Mexican labor migration, it talks about Chinese exclusion, it talks about international development. So much of the book is an attempt to really get a handle on all the things that are out there in policy, and really try to show how each of these issues is connected with something else, and to show how people's disagreements. If you really think that that the DREAM Act is a good thing, then it might mean that you also believe these other things about immigration policy. And here's an interesting example that I never really thought about until I got to this part of the book, is the DREAM Act would legalize people who were brought to this country as children. But the 14th Amendment kind of does the same thing. The 14th Amendment is kind of a legalization program in a way, because if you didn't have the 14th Amendment, you'd have kids born in the country with their parents in the country unlawfully, and they would be, then, if you didn't have the 14th Amendment, those kids would be in the country illegally, and you'd need a DREAM Act, or you'd be advocating for a DREAM Act with them. So there are a lot of connections like that. So let me just do one other thing, just for another 5 minutes, and then I'm really interested in what questions or pushback or more requests for elaboration here you might have. And it's really to say a little bit about the specific argument in the first chapter. And this particular, I want to mention this because I think that much of the book, if I had to pick a chapter that sort of drives a lot about, I'm going to do that. That's fine. I was done with that part of the talk anyway.
Maybe
So-
get the updated version.
Okay. Oh, okay.
That's a good sequel.
Hopefully I can just. Let's continue with this. Okay. Well, I know what to do. So, you have all that triangle and burned into your retina at this point. So what does it mean to, I think a lot of what drives the book with regard to many of the things that follow after chapter 1 is really the description and analysis I give in chapter 1 on what it means to live in the country unlawfully. And one of the ways that I think about this is chapter 1 is an attempt to explain why it is that we have 11 million people in the country who are here in violation of immigration law. How did this happen? And I think a lot of your explanation for why this happened and how this happened is going to drive many reviews on many things in this area of law. And here's the short version of it, is that this country, especially in the period when, as they say, the frontier was moving west, and labor was needed to till the soil, to cut down the forests, to work the fields and the factories, and some would say also to engage in armed conflict against Native Americans. But a lot of what the whole history of American society in the last 150 years, or really maybe its entire history, if we can really go back to slavery as part of this, has been the quest for a labor force. People who would drive this, or at least be the basis of this economic engine. And what happens in the just starting from, if you just almost arbitrarily pick the period after the Civil War, and you have just take one example, the building of the Transcontinental Railroad was largely it was a labor force that was 90% Chinese immigrants. And so after the railroads were built, there were economic recessions, and you have a swing toward Asian exclusion, Chinese exclusion. Chinese are excluded, who's going to do the work? It's Japanese labor. Japanese ended up being subject to exclusion laws. Became the Filipinos. As Philippine independence came on, that labor source dried up. And much of this is a story of the turn toward Latin American immigration, particularly Mexican immigration in the period of the early 20th century. And this was an interesting period because it was a period of not of a lot of strict border control. In fact, the first border patrol agents were called Chinese inspectors. And the reason they were called Chinese inspectors is that the function of the border patrol originally was to keep Chinese from going through Mexico and getting around the exclusion laws. And so you had this period, roughly speaking, from the early 1900s, early 1900s on up to the 1960s, where migration from Mexico was not controlled, and I mean in two senses. There was not a lot of border control, and there was no numerical cap on Mexican immigration. And so people came back and forth. There were a lot of ideas that were very influential in Congress. The reason we want Mexicans, they will go back, they won't stay, but they'll be a flexible, cheap labor force. And this was also reinforced by the PROSERA program. The PROSERA program is a program that basically allowed for temporary workers to come to this country legally, but under very exploitative conditions. What happens in the 1960s is that this all changes. In the 1960s, you have a series of what we now think of as civil rights laws, Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. And you also have the Immigration Amendments of 1965, which did away with a lot of the discriminatory, racially exclusionary laws that preceded it. But the cost of imposing that formal equality and saying we're going to stop this regime that's explicitly discriminatory against Asian immigrants, the cost of that is we're going to treat all countries the same. And it means that the situation you had with Mexico is the Bracero program ended because of, to really curtail labor abuses that have come to light. For the first time, you have Mexican immigration being numerically controlled. And at the same time, the emission categories get reworked in such a way that there's no line to stand in for people who come to this country who don't have a college degree or close relatives. So you had this entire history of many sectors of the American economy becoming reliant upon Latin American labor. That was pretty much cut off, but people still kept coming, and the jobs were still there, and the employers still wanted to hire them. And so the regime shifts from a regime of Chinese exclusion, for example, to a regime of we're going to make a lot of people illegal, but we're going to kind of look the other way most of the time. We're not going to have enforcement systems that serious, but people will come and do the work, and every once in a while we'll be shocked that they're here and can't come. But it's a very discretionary, sort of system. And so, in a nutshell, the system that we have in this country, and the reason we have 11 million people in the country who are undocumented is because we have a system of very selective admissions. Lets very few people in that the economy wants to employ. Then we have very selective enforcement because you have 11 million people in the country, but Congress doesn't fund enough enforcement capacity because I don't think the political will is there to keep people from these jobs. And it means that you have a system that really runs on selective admission, selective enforcement, and a huge amount of discretion. Huge amount of discretion. So that's when I tend to complicate this idea. It's not a simple matter. I mean, of course, people are 11 million people in the country unlawfully. But what's really going on is not just that they're in the country unlawfully. What's really going on is how is the discretion going to be exercised to choose the unlucky, undocumented migrants who get apprehended, detained, deported? Who makes those decisions? So you can see how this relates back to my concerns about Arizona's immigration enforcement. Because if it's not a clear matter of someone being in the country lawfully or not, it's really a matter of discretion being exercised to choose the unlucky few who are deported from time to time. I don't mean, by the way, to diminish the harshness of enforcement. It's very harsh, but numerically, it's the unlucky who get deported. Under those circumstances, that's the reason why I think of this. I think of the idea that people are in the country illegally. That's only the beginning of the inquiry. The real inquiry is, how is the law going to be enforced against people who are here unlawfully, and is there discrimination there? And so my concern with Arizona, for example, is that the reason the state and local role needs to be diminished is because unless the state and local role is diminished, the chances are very high that discretion will be exercised by people who are going to make traffic stops based on the way someone looks. And so it becomes an area where discretion could be exercised in a way that's discriminatory. Discrimination is very hard to detect when it happens. It's very hard to remedy when it happens. And so this is just an example of how I'm using chapter 1 in that rendition of immigration history then to lead to other conclusions. Other conclusions with regard to, in particular, the idea of state and local role. So that's just one example, but there are many others in the book. But this is just an example of how it is that you start with history, and a lot of different things follow. But I would also concede that there are people who have different views of this history, and so that's in the spirit of suggesting that if you come up with a very different view of what policies ought to be today, I think a lot of this may have to do with the fact that a lot of this may have to do with what it is that a lot of it may have to do with the way people view that history and how they view that history comes and affects the future. But that, again, goes back to the first purpose of the book, which is that I'm also, there's a lot of suggestions I make in the book. For example, greater reliance on international economic development initiatives. But at the very least, I'm hopeful that the book will allow people to talk to each other about why they disagree. And I'm perfectly willing to accept that people will have to review the history with me, and that's the reason they disagree. So let me stop there and see what questions you have, or what I've provoked in here, or what I can elaborate. So thanks.
Thank you for your insightful views on, the paper was very instrumental in helping me to understand many things. But one thing I'm wondering is, what do you think should be the role of the country government where immigrants are coming from? I'm from El Salvador, and we benefit from the remittances
Yes.
that immigrants send. And so the government has an investment, in terms of having this, people say, well, we used to export coffee, now we export people,
Yes.
so they can send their money, and it's really their money that keeps the economy going.
Right.
So, when talking about immigration, then this is not just an issue for the United States. How should we engage in also the countries where, these people are coming from, and what the role should be?
One of the things that, thank you for the question, one of the things that I found in years of working on these immigration issues is that many of the immigration issues that we deal with are not really immigration issues. Right? And in a sense, that's behind the question. These are issues of economic development, and they're bilateral or regional, certainly more multilateral. And so one of the things that Chapter 7 talks about is that having spent 200 pages talking about immigration solutions, well, that's not really where the more durable solutions lie. So a couple thoughts on this. I mean, one insight that I draw from your comment question is that in many respects, the function of American immigration policy, one of the reasons why I think we have this system, it's sort of I gave a cynical view that this is what the employer wants, and it actually kind of works for a lot of the employer community to have this kind of disposable workforce. But it's interesting that it also provides, it's a substitute for other forms of foreign aid as well, right? It's kind of economic development. So I think that one thing is that we have to recognize that's really what is going on. I think it also means that many of the solutions lie in creating substitutes for this kind of cycle. And substitutes include initiatives in sending countries that allow people to give them more of a choice to stay at home. But that's complicated too in a couple ways. I mean, one of the reasons it's complicated, I think, is because suppose there were a realization that this is the way that what's going on. And suppose we were to have a program that say, we're going to invest heavily in communities from which many Mexican immigrants come. How would the Salvadorian government feel about that? To treat Mexico, in some sense, would seem more favorable. So that's another challenge. So I'm not sure I'm totally answering your question as much to acknowledge, but I think that's really part of what's going on, and that's why a lot of what is going on in the book is to try to move beyond these things. Because I think legalization is only a short-term solution. And it's also true that many countries are engaging in what is basically some people call diaspora management, because it really is so important. So I'm not sure I'm totally answering your question, but except to completely endorse the way you're looking at this. Yeah.
So I thought it was interesting to talk about Brown as being now an iconic decision, and then the discussion taking from Brown up to Filer.
Yeah.
But what I also think is interesting is Brown, I mean, just the initial reaction that, ultimately we had to call in the National Guard to enforce Brown, but that didn't happen with Filer. So, what's sort of the initial public reaction to Filer, and then what can that say about just the the racism behind, or the reaction to both decisions.
Yeah, I mean, so it's really interesting to think about Brown and comparing it to Plyler, because part of the way I deal with Plyler, part of the way I deal with Brown in the book is to think of it as some kind of a given, a very iconic sort of decision, a decision that is somewhat uncontested. But that, of course, papers over the fact that most of the last 60 years has been about contesting Brown. And it's kind of in that space between what the law says and what's actually happening. So, with regard to Brown, I mean, I think it has been contested, and I think that Plyler has been contested. The reason I use Plyler is not because I'm trying to say that that's so much a robust legal precedent as much as Plyler's a lens to see what the controversy has been. But here's what's interesting. I think Plyler, those three issues being contested, the way I think about those three issues is that it's a way of thinking about a regime in which the law, there are a lot of people who are outside the law, they're here legally, and I'm trying to complicate that by saying, just because they're here illegally doesn't mean they don't have rights, doesn't mean we shouldn't have rights. So now I'm thinking out loud here. What's the analog in Brown? I mean, in Brown, we have the idea that the law in theory is supposed to say one thing. There's been such a contest to really implement it. And maybe there's something very similar going on the more you look at it, which is that Brown, the law says we should be inclusive. It doesn't quite work that way. In Plyler, we say the law should be exclusive in the sense that people are here in the country illegally. It's not that simple either. So maybe that's what but I think that's an important complication.
Not to go too closely off the gentleman's question, but how do you see a shift in the conversation between looking at immigration or illegal immigrants, to use the common term, from a domestic issue to rather a combination of foreign and domestic?
How do I see that?
All too often in the U.S.,
All right.
it's solely a domestic issue, and people aren't willing to go into the foreign aspect of the issue itself.
So how
how do we facilitate, or how does that conversation get facilitated?
Yeah, I mean, there are different ways to think about this. I mean, one is, it's always hard in politics and political cycles to say things are more complicated than you think. And maybe part of the book is to, this whole idea of having a triangle capture everything is kind of odd oversimplification of that. And the whole message of the book is things are way more complicated than you think. So part of what I'm trying to do is to suggest that is really an intervention in that sort of very domestic framing, because the book really is about a lot of domestic law, but ultimately it's, well, chapter 1 is really about how the reason we have 11 million undocumented people in the country is because of transnational dynamics, and in particular social networks that are created reliant on economic relationships and kept coming in spite of it, no matter how offensive. So part of what I'm trying to do is just to I don't know, give information or sort of education. That's all we do to teach people. But I also think that it's kind of a different. We're at this interesting moment in immigration history because on the one hand, I think we're in this moment we really celebrate the civil rights movement and how it made immigration law more equal. But the contradiction there is it makes it seem like more like if we just did more civil rights stuff, that it would solve the immigration problem. But I'm not sure that's true either, because I think people come here for very complicated reasons having to do with their own situation.
So I want to complexify this even
Yeah.
more, just
Sure.
because I like you.
Okay.
So I really do appreciate your discussion of the evolution of deportation as labor policy, which I think is exactly right. But there's another piece of the story that I'd like to hear your thoughts about. Concomitant with this rise of substituted deportation for labor policy that had existed for 100 years before that with Latino workers is the rise of what some have referred to as a prison industrial complex, the rise of a deportation machinery focused on lawful immigrants who have been convicted of minor offenses, so hundreds of thousands of those people have been deported. Machinery that has disenfranchised millions of African Americans, I mean citizens, for criminal convictions. And it seems to me that if you chart all these things, and I'm pretty sure because I've done it, you find a very similar trend line
Yes,
among
yes.
all those things. So it seems that we have to really be a little harder edged in our critique here about the role of race and racism
Yeah.
and cynical politicians and get tough on crime
Yeah.
policies, that these things are related to the explanation of
Yeah.
how the thing is developed.
Yeah, I mean, one thing, I mean, maybe I'm not being as hard-hitting as I am in some parts of the book, but I mean, there's a point in the book, particularly in chapter 1, when I just say right out, this is a story of labor and race. And I'm much more explicit about the sort of the historical timeline from slavery up to the present. So I mean, I very much see this really as a story of labor and race. And more to the point, I think this is where you bring in deportation of people who are in the country, who've come here, who have permanent residence, and fell in disenfranchisement, for example, privatization, is that this is a very, it's a very cynical use of law, really. It's really hiding behind the power of the law as written, and kind of a willful ignorance of the law as it operates on the books. This, by the way, gets back to the Brown point a bit, right? Because much of what we've seen in Brown has been an emphasis on, we ended segregation, so what else do you want? You're here illegally, so what do we have to talk about? Isn't that the end of the discussion? So, and also the privatization thing, though, ties in a different way to my story about discretion, because I think that the problem of Arizona enforcement and the problem of private prisons making decisions that affect someone's ability to defend themselves in immigration court, those are very similar problems of delegating power inappropriately in the same way that the reason I think DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, a temporary reprieve, the president announced originally in June 2012, the reason that's important is it's important to make sure that ICE agents in the field don't make decisions that are inconsistent with announced priorities and don't make decisions that are discriminatory. So I think a lot of what we're talking about here is actually quite related. In one sense, going to the international, but also digging more deeply into analogous problems domestically.
So how does immigration fit into the two party policies right now, and how do you think it might change in the upcoming election? Because I remember the last one, that was us and the people that they like to talk about, like how the Republican stance on immigration hurt them,
Right.
and how they might revamp it to have this new law that's more appealing to those portions of the country that the disenfranchised people who are at risk, and who Democrats have typically had to support.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not the kind of political scientist who would be able to cite to you, figures on how you get to 51 senators, or 60 senators, I should say, and 218 people in Congress. But there's a few things that I think are worth saying here. One is that it's always about the next election. Maybe that's not literally true, but I mean, it's true in many cases. And so I think part of what you're seeing is the next election is a different kind of next election depending where you are. There was a moment when the next election was the midterms in 2014, right? Very different dynamic than when the next election is the 2016 presidential election. And I think that the issue has been, how do you get to 218 in the House? That's been the issue, and that's really what deterred Obama from expanding DACA in this period, the summer of 2014 until after the midterms. Now I think the Republican Party is in this dilemma of having allowed a lot of people who are quite opposed to any kind of legalization, really dominated the agenda to the point where it's hard to pivot to a policy that is not unlike the policy that John McCain had before 2008, favoring legalization, pairing up with Ted Kennedy. So two things. One is that I think that this is really, we have to be sensitive to where we are in election cycles, but I think it's also clear that the polarization on a party basis is much more pronounced than it was in the early 2000s. Much more pronounced. proper form of legalization, for example. And I also think that another thing to think about cycles is not just where you're in the cycle, and not just the partisan things, but how many decisions are being made in state and local governments, and how many are being made in federal government. I think that another way to think about this is that there's been a kind of almost hydraulic effect of as Congress gets gridlocked, we get more and more differentiation among the states. But
One question that I would have for you is, now this interesting concept of Americans in waiting.
right.
You've stressed to both of these folks. Are you making an argument that, in fact, what we've got with this discriminatory enforcement is a kind of an ambivalence between whether we want to treat unauthorized migrants as Americans in waiting or as illegals? And that if we were going to be consistent, we got to go one way or the other. And going one way would be to say, deport them all.
Right.
And then you could say, well, wait a minute, the labor market will handle that, there are all sorts of jobs at stake. And on the other hand, to be consistent, you have to say, find a way to grant all of these people citizenship, or at least some kind of legality.
Right.
And is that in effect what you're saying when you get into the discriminatory enforcement argument, that it shows an ambivalence that is incoherent legally or incoherent normatively in some way about how we should treat these people? And are you in effect making an argument to say, we've got to get consistent on this, go one way or the other, and I think I know which way you would prefer to go in that regard, but you're saying there are two different possible ways to respond to this crisis. Well, I don't know if I'm hearing you correctly about the argument.
Well, I mean,
I'm going beyond what you said. But
yeah, I mean, clearly I come out with a view that that the equities in history argue for treating unauthorized migrants as Americans in waiting. I would recognize that through legalization. But and here's a couple of different caveats to that. One is that I don't think legalization is really the long-term answer, because then you just have the same issue in the year 2044, in the same way that we're having the same conversation now that Congress had in the 1980s, and they enacted legalization without a whole lot else going on. That's one thing. The other reason my enthusiasm or maybe my support for legalization is tempered is that I wonder really about the power of law here and the power to make these decisions. And we have this idea in this country that we choose immigrants, we let people in, and then and we might make some mistakes, and that mistake might be remedied through legalization. But we tend to believe in some power of the law and government to choose people. Imagine a very different world, a world in which legalizations happen all the time. It's a world in which we say we can't really know who's going to really be a contributing member of society, so we should regularize people on a regular basis. Which starts to look actually like a little bit more like what's been going on in Europe. Some people would find that completely nonsensical. It would just incentivize people to come illegally. But others would say, well, then you really know who's got the workers here. You know, and so part of what I'm saying, and part of the reason I'm ambivalent is partly because though I favor legalization, I'm a little bit, that view is tempered by its limitations. And not just the limitations of not just political limitations, but also limitations of wondering if this is the way things work. Because I think what actually been happening in immigration policy, one of the myths that I try to debunk in chapter 6 of the book is that we think of legalization as very unusual events, but actually they're very common. We have certainly case-by-case legalizations, but we've also had small legalization programs for which there are some years. And part of the politics, this gets back to the political question, part of the politics has been to sort of demonize legalization as some event that is very catastrophic and failure. one way to think about this is legalization is actually what happens in a healthy system. And not just legalization at the federal level, but there are micro and mini legalizations that take place all the time. Certainly when we give in-state tuition and driver's licenses, but also when we decide that the fire company should go put out a fire in someone's house just because they're the country. So there's a lot of ground up mini legalizations that are taking place as well. Much of the, okay, go ahead, sure.
No, sorry.
No.
I wanted to ask you, I know this isn't probably the first thing you think we think about, like non-citizens, people waiting to enter America, but recently when they were going through the civil rights movement and stuff,
Right.
I remember seeing a clip on YouTube of someone in Congress mentioning how there's like so many people who live in the territories of the United States who are subject to like some weird law, not weird laws, but they're subject to some laws, not to others, and they can't vote, and that's something
Right.
that is still hanging around. So it's very like easy to think like people crossing the border, but
Right.
not so much attention is given to people that are already kind of sort of within the United States, but then it's still hanging.
I think there's been a lot of more controversy in the last few years than the previous 10 or 15 about the status of U.S. citizen nationals. The idea that people they sort of belong in an international law sense to the United States, but they don't have the full rights of citizenship. And so that was historically true with a lot of U.S. possessions during the more clearly colonial era when the United States possessions included places like the Philippines. And so that's true now with a few islands in the Swains Island and American Samoa. And so there's that. But it's interesting how these forms of membership, they just sort of replicate themselves. It's like it's that line that is often attributed to Mark Twain that history doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. Which, by the way, I researched this and discovered that Mark Twain never actually said this, but there's this idea, well, it sounds like something he would have said, so. But anyway, it's taken these different forms, right? It's certainly taken the form of explicit discrimination. And we don't have that degree of explicitness in the laws, but my take on this is that this is a system that is very disadvantageous to some countries compared to others. And I also think that, but that's, if you're troubled by this status of U.S. nationals that don't have full right to citizenship, I think that the same kind of troubling disquiet that we feel about people being second-class citizens in this country, and it's taken these different forms. I mean, one of the things that's interesting to think about, one way to think about history is that think about Chinese exclusion, and think about Mexican exclusion in a sense. Chinese exclusion took place in very, very explicit forms. Chinese laborers are not allowed in this country, and they're not eligible citizens. It doesn't happen that way anymore. What happens is that the law seems to be welcoming, but the application of the law really means that the precariousness of life is going to depend potentially on the widow who stops you. The arrest being the discretion that matters in that context. And in that sense, it's the same sort of thing. So, I mean, I have to admit there's a great deal of cynicism in this book, tempered by some hope that, maybe if we name these things, that we'll learn from them. Yeah. Go ahead.
No, I was just asking, have you ever helped anyone to gain their legalization? Have you ever been involved in that?
On a day-to-day, just handling someone's case.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I worked some as an immigration lawyer before I went into law teaching. That was a long time ago. But more recently, I've volunteered at clinics for people to get doctor's notes.
I asked the question because it takes such a long time.
Yes.
And the money involved, no one talks about the finances.
Right.
What people have to pay.
Right.
I mean, happily, most of us who work,
Right.
with the migrants, at least get the pro bono lawyers and so forth and so on, and organizations that can help. But most of our American people don't understand money
Right.
involved. And for some, that's one reason they don't even legal. You know, and then even the idea of renewing your ID every year, you know, it costs over $400 every year just to renew your.
Well, it depends on which one you have, I mean,
identification, too.
yeah,
But
which one-
this is something that people don't
Yeah.
understand when they start criticizing and so forth and so on.
right.
How difficult it is. It's just not an easy thing that somebody you sign a paper and you can come.
Right.
It can take almost a year.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you raised that because I think a lot of the political debate has to do with the characterization of the immigrant community. And you see this in various different characterizations, right? And there's contest about this, and a lot of social scientists look into this more closely. You know, but one contest is that immigrants, whether they're here lawfully or not, there's a reluctance to become part of American society. And I think one of the things that's often brought up in that context is the low number of immigrants who want to naturalize. But it's interesting that it is very expensive. And so it's not only that it's expensive, but I know this because I went through this in my own family. You know, my mother spent 30 years as a permanent resident before she decided to naturalize. And it's not like she woke up every morning and said, am I going to naturalize today or not? What happens is that I suppose in some abstract sense it's always an option. But what happens is that you never get around to it, you don't have the money, it's such a bureaucracy, and this thing you know, you came here when you're 27 and you're 60 years old, right? And then is that someone who didn't want to become an American? Not really, but I mean, clearly, if she had been really intent on becoming one, maybe she would have become one. But it was not because she didn't want to be here. So, and I think that but I give this as an example. This goes back to the political question, the question of politics. I think there's a lot of myths going around about reluctance to naturalize. I also think there's a lot of myths going around about language, because I think that the degree of English language acquisition and the loss of the home country language in the second, third generation, that loss of the original language is really quite dramatic, actually. Even though some of the myth is that people just want to speak Spanish. It's not really true in terms of the actual demographics.
I used to work in a research program in El Salvador with minors, and we actually started working with government. So, you know, they had some ideas of how we could help them. And when we were talking to people about, you know, the definition of status of these kids, and even having come here to the United States for immigrant, I'd like to know how you explain to someone in plain language what would make someone legally from the point of view of the law. I mean, like, what you have as chapter 1,
Right.
you know, like legal versus undocumented.
Right.
And as you said, like, what do you understand about legal? But I'm like, what exactly says the law in terms of, you know, having violated exactly what? You know, because the way that we explained to people was that this was almost like an administrative, you know, kind of violation, not so much as this is not a crime. But then, you know, what makes, besides like how you decided to frame it, is it as a documented or as a illegal? But from the point of view of the law, what can you say about those two terms?
Well, one of the things I probably glossed over and overgeneralized about in the interest of time is that in chapter 1, I sort of take apart, well, at the most general level, I sort of say, being in the country unlawfully is not as cut and dried as you might think. It's a lot of gray area. But now you're prompting me to explain that there are really at least 3 or 4 different types of gray areas. And I'm not sure this necessarily is persuasive to your hypothetical listener, but I think it's worth thinking about the way the law is structured. First of all, there are many people whose status in the law is a gray area, like temporary protected status, parole, the law, that's part of the law is to create these between statuses. Then, there are a lot of places where people are standing in line and they qualify, but they're waiting, but they're qualified in the sense that they fit in the cat immigration. then the law has, so then there are people who are clearly in the country illegally, but whom the law, current law, provides a mechanism for getting legal status, even though they're illegal today, they can get legal status later. Then there are people who are in the country illegally who don't have a way under current law to legalize themselves, but who have a lot of different equities and are not going to be deported as a practical matter. So these are all complications. Now, I don't know how persuasive that is. You know, I think there's a certain degree of saying, well, these people are in the country illegally, and at that point, you know, it's interesting. Some of the stuff that actually ends up being persuasive, although in some sense it's kind of not sort of, you know, it's more of a appeal to emotion, I suppose, is really, but you know, then you get to what I mentioned earlier about immigration as affiliation. That's just a fancy academic way to think about it, but sort of the idea, well, these are the people who take care of your house, your kids and your food. You trust these things. Why isn't that enough? You know, so then you kind of shift over to that. But it's a complication because I'm trying to both give license to thinking about this in those emotional terms, but also to say that there's actually a legal basis in the law, right? But, you know,
Just as a follow-up, one of the things that I mentioned, when I find someone who's like, oh, you're illegal and that's it. And I say, well, if you have to treat everybody equally, you know, like your definition of the law, like either or,
Right.
like you are breaking the law or you're not,
right?
they should actually, you know, go after the businesses that also
Right.
hire these people who are breaking the law. Hire people without really, you know, proper documentation. So,
Yeah.
in that sense, what does the law have to say about, you know, having, you know, this very large segment of the labor market, and then we are not touching it?
Yeah, and that's true. This gets back to the earlier conversation about sort of, I'm very cynical in that sense about written law. Anyone?
I just want to add 3 more categories to your
Yeah.
impressive list. There are also large numbers of people who think they're in legal status,
Right.
but are mistaken. There are people who are in legal status, but could be found to be in an illegal status if a government agent wanted to look closely enough at their case,
Right.
which happened after 9/11 for a lot of Muslims. There are people who are in legal statuses, like green card holders, who are subject to removal and probably know it if the government found out about
Right.
it. There are people who are U.S. citizens but don't know it, and who the government doesn't
Right.
know. And there are people who are legal so long as they stay in the United States, but if they're unfortunate enough to travel to Canada or outside the U.S. to try to get back in,
Right.
and it turns out they're subject to grounds of exclusion. So it's even, I mean, it's incredibly complicated.
Yeah.
It's really hard to explain.
And actually, one of the, I don't know if it's really a regret, but one of the things, you know, what happens, you know, you work on a book like this and then all of a sudden it's out there and you sort of think about all the stuff you should have put on Twitter. But 9/11 is a really interesting example here because one of the myths, I mean, I'm not saying that everyone, or maybe, I'm not saying maybe anyone in this room believes this, but, you know, one of the ideas that comes from 9/11 is that Congress stepped in and created a lot of laws, and it did create a lot of laws, but a lot of the targeting of Arab and Muslim people from predominantly Arab and Muslim countries, a lot of that targeting that took place after 9/11 had nothing to do with the laws. It had to do with the discretionary enforcement of old laws. And so one of the things that so much of this book is sort of telling the story of labor and race in the continuum, you know, really up through Chinese exclusion and Mexican and Latin American immigration in the 20th century. But actually, even a better or different but better example that's related has to do with selective enforcement against post 9/11 selective enforcement, and nothing to do. And John Ashcroft was on record saying, if you so much as spit on the sidewalk, and he actually sort of, you know, drew upon Bobby Kennedy saying this about organized crime in the 1960s. If you so much as spit on the sidewalk, okay. But under laws that were not going to be, that didn't require Congress to do a thing. So to me, I mean, part of what I'm trying to do in the book is to sort of recapture in some sense what it means to have the rule of law, because the rule of law, I mean, I'm sure some people would think that, you know, I'm sort of trying to subvert the rule of law by even using that in the way I'm using it, but I'm really troubled by the system we have. It's a very lawless one, lot of bad things can happen for bad reasons, and we'll never know about it, and it leads, ultimately, I think it leads to a lack of confidence in the system at all, and it really means that people are going to really not only be very cynical about this, but really think the whole thing doesn't make any sense and just not to have any part of it. And that gets back to the political question, because things are just so polarized with things. Yeah, so let me just do one thing, because I think we're out of time, but I wanted to share with you one thing from the book, because, I mean, we've been talking, I started out with this being very analytical. I guess it's an occupational hazard or being a law professor. I showed you a diagram and that kind of thing, and some of this is an attempt to sort of, to kind of convey the analysis here, and I'm sorry, I'm trying to be analytical. But I also, to me, a lot of this book I wrote not just for law professors and lawyers, or certainly for anyone, not just analytical. I think a lot of this has to do with the human story. And I think some of you have raised the human story, your questions and comments, and I really, really like that, because I wanted to move beyond the analytical. So let me just read you one paragraph that has meant a lot to me from the introduction. It's about the judge who issued the Plyler versus Doe decision. The judge whose name was William Wayne Justice, so a better name for a judge than Judge Justice. I just want to read you one paragraph out of this book. Years after the Supreme Court upheld his decision to strike down the Texas law, Judge Justice, the trial judge in the case against the Tyler, Texas school district, said, quote, "As a result of that decision, I think probably several million children got an education, and that's the case I was proud of." End quote. After the judge died in 2009, a reflection on his passing told the story related by his wife, Sue Justice. Soon after her husband issued his decision, a small bouquet of flowers arrived at their home in Tyler. On the note was a card signed with one illegible name and 2 X's. To find out who sent the flowers, Mrs. Justice called the florist, told her that 3 Mexican laborers had come in and paid with $2 bills and some change all the money they had with them, and asked him to send the bouquet to Mrs. Justice. So there are a lot of human stories in this as well, and I think one of the things I'm trying to do is to bring that to life. So, thanks for your questions.